Did the US just test the limits of Mexico's sovereignty on purpose? What unfolded this week along the mouth of the Rio Grande was not a minor diplomatic misunderstanding. It was not an accident of geography, a misplaced warning sign, or a harmless contractor error. It was a signal, deliberate or reckless, that raises troubling questions about the trajectory of American policy, presidential authority, and the fragile balance of power across the U.S. Mexico border. Let's begin with the facts. Only hours after former President Donald Trump publicly stated he would be okay with launching military strikes inside Mexico to stop drug trafficking, Mexican Marines discovered Department of Defense-style warning signs planted on Mexican soil. The signs declared the area a restricted zone, supposedly under U.S. military jurisdiction. They threatened detention, they referenced a commander, and they sat squarely on territory that every map, every treaty, and every legal document recognized as belonging to Mexico. Mexico removed the signs immediately. The reaction was swift, stern, and unmistakable. This is our land. The United States later admitted it had, in fact, hired contractors to install the signs, but insisted the intent was simply to clarify a boundary, altered by changes in water flow and shifting river contours. A convenient explanation, but one that collapses under minimal scrutiny. Because here's the deeper issue. This was not a technical mistake, it was a political moment. And political moments do not happen in a vacuum. A dangerous convergence. Foreign policy meets domestic power. To understand the stakes, we must examine the timing. This sign-planting incident happened at the precise moment when Trump escalated his rhetoric on Mexico, framing the fight against cartels as a justification for military intervention across the border. His message was simple and striking. Would I launch strikes in Mexico to stop drugs? It's okay with me. That statement alone would have been extraordinary. Presidents of both parties, for decades, avoided such language because it risks destabilizing the most important bilateral relationship in the Western Hemisphere. But this time, those words were followed, almost immediately, by an act that appeared to physically manifest the idea of U.S. military authority reaching past the border. Coincidence? Or choreography? Whichever it was, one truth stands out. This moment reflects a dangerous merging of domestic political narratives with foreign policy behavior. And that combination has historically been a red flag for democratic institutions. Because while these signs were going up in Mexico, something else was happening in Washington. Trump accused a group of Democratic lawmakers, many of them veterans and former intelligence officers, of sedition punishable by death, simply for reminding the military that they could refuse unlawful orders. This is the kind of rhetoric that turns political opposition into internal enemies, the kind of language that blurs the boundary between political disagreement and treason. When that mindset intersects with foreign policy, what you get is a leader who sees opposition at home as illegitimate and sovereign boundaries abroad as negotiable. That is a recipe the world has seen before, and history shows it does not end quietly. Why this incident matters more than it appears. The U.S. explanation, shifting sandbanks and river morphology, is technically plausible. The Rio Grande does change shape. Boundaries do occasionally require remarking. But experts in U.S. military law were quick to point out a simple truth. Military warning signs of this type cannot legally be placed on sovereign foreign soil for any reason. That's not a gray area. That's not a bureaucratic slip. That's a line you simply do not cross. And that is what makes Mexico's reaction so forceful. They did not treat it as a misunderstanding. They treated it as a provocation, even if a subtle one. Because Mexico understands something that American audiences sometimes forget. Border symbolism is not symbolic. In geopolitics, symbols are power. A sign is not just a sign. It is a claim. It is a test. It is a message. And on a continent with a long, painful history of U.S. interventions, from Central America to the Caribbean, Mexico cannot afford to let even a symbolic breach go unanswered. Not now. Not when a former president is openly discussing cross-border strikes. Not when the U.S. military is already conducting lethal anti-cartel operations at sea. Not when political incentives in Washington reward tough talk more than diplomatic restraint. The stakes are not hypothetical. A U.S. president has enormous latitude to authorize force abroad, especially under broad justifications like counterterrorism or counter-narcotics. If such authorizations are paired with rhetoric portraying Mexico as a security failure or a threat to American lives, the path to escalation becomes frighteningly short. All it would take is one incident, one confrontation, one misinterpreted action, one politically convenient crisis for the situation to spiral. What this reveals about the future of U.S.-Mexico relations. What we are witnessing is the emergence of a new strategic doctrine, whether official or implicit, the militarization of the border as an extension of domestic political identity. Mexico is no longer just a neighbor. It is becoming a stage on which American leaders project control, strength, and ideological dominance. This new posture has three consequences. 1. The border becomes a theater of power, not cooperation. Instead of shared strategy, the narrative shifts to unilateral action, the belief that the U.S. has the right to operate on or near Mexico's territory without consent. 2. Domestic political warfare spills across borders. When American leaders describe political opponents as seditious, they normalize the idea that power should be defended not through institutions, but through force, literal or symbolic. This mindset shapes foreign decisions too. 3. The margin for error shrinks. What once would be dismissed as a misunderstanding now carries geopolitical weight. Every sign, every aircraft crossing a boundary, every patrol in disputed waters becomes a potential flashpoint. And all of this is unfolding in a hemisphere where memories of foreign intrusion remain raw. The larger question, what kind of power will the U.S. be? At its core, this controversy forces a reckoning. Is the United States prepared to maintain its global leadership through diplomacy, partnership, and respect for sovereignty? Or is it drifting toward a model where domestic anger, political absolutism, and militarized rhetoric spill over into foreign policy? The world is watching for the answer, and so is Mexico. Because this was not merely a sign on a beach. It was a symbol of a crossroads. One path leads toward cooperation, stability, and a coordinated fight against the real forces harming both nations: organized crime, corruption, trafficking networks, and economic inequality. The other path leads toward confrontation, miscalculation, and a border that stops being a line of partnership and becomes a line of tension. The question now is whether this moment will be remembered as a warning or a beginning. Do you think this was an innocent mistake or a deliberate test of how far the U.S. can push Mexico's sovereignty?